Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Psychology and Ideology of Tolerance. A wolf in sheep's clothing. We must grudgingly admit that even as we were trying to devise, with scientific determinism, a therapy for the few, we were led to promote an ethical disease among the many. E.H. Erickson. On the day when crime dons the apparel of innocence, through a curious transposition peculiar to our times, it is innocence that is called to justify itself. Albert Camus. Hi everybody, and today I'm going to continue with what I looked at in the Macbeth. You can see the thumbnail to the Macbeth video I did, which for those of you that didn't see it yet, don't be misled. It's not purely about Shakespeare's Macbeth. It's an interpretation of Macbeth using the work of this guy, Thomas Szasz. And I'm going to do a few videos on his work because I find them immensely helpful understanding today's climate of what I explore in this video, the concept of tolerance. And I don't think you have to be a Martian who's just come down from Mars to realise that we are living in this paradoxical culture where the language of tolerance, and I'll be talking specifically about language as we go along, and I'm going to do a future video specifically about Szasz's interpretation of language and why it's so crucial, but it'll be alluded to today. But the language of tolerance, so everyone has to be tolerant, diversity is important, people's identity is important, and we have to tolerate lots of things. But the general climate, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, I think most people, reasonable people, would accept and agree that we live in very intolerant times, in the sense that in the guise of tolerance there's an awful lot of parallel monologues going on, people not listening to each other, people being vehemently ideological, whether it's left or whether it's right. So I wanted to explore, given that ideological fundamentalism, what is the psychology behind it? And what I find useful in Thomas Szasz's work is the way he looks at the increasingly therapeutic nature of our society. And from that, I've mentioned in the previous Macbeth video, he was a libertarian conservative. So he had some quite interesting tensions within his own, that this constant tension that's inevitable between conservative principles and libertarian principles. But ultimately, and this is what I'll explore briefly today, he was massively a proponent of individual responsibility. And I think that's one of the major reasons why some of you will never have heard of him before, despite the fact in the 70s and 80s he was arguably the most famous psychiatrist in the whole of America. He was very well known, a lot of media appearances, wrote many books. The Myth of Mental Illness, which was its my memory's going, was it 1961? I think it was published, but that was a bestseller. He wrote various best-selling books and had a lot of the limelight. He was on William F. Buckley's firing line. And I find him, there's a lot of interviews on YouTube I thoroughly encourage you to check out. I love the way he argues. Very, very consistent. He starts with very clear principles, which you can choose to disagree with, but his argumentation is very closely aligned with his initial premises. And if nothing else, I think he's a great avatar almost for how to conduct an argument, knowing what your initial premises are. And I think it makes argumentation easier from a certain point of view, because no matter what they throw at him, because he's so clear with his initial premises, he bats away quite a lot of objections. And I just find it very refreshing, because a lot of word salad type debates that go on today, as I've used the phrase before, parallel monologues, people aren't listening to each other, whereas he always seems to take questions directly and deal with them directly, even if it's just a direct refutation of them. So anyway, I'm interested in this relationship between psychology and ideology, and his argument is that we've become increasingly medicalized. And he died in 2012, which is relevant because I think he died before peak woke, but he was describing up until his death, throughout the 20th century and into the early 21st century, this, on the one hand, increased medicalization. So a lot of things that used to be deemed to be the realm of ethics or individual morality became therapized. They were given a diagnosis. They become part of therapy culture. Mental illness and its various diagnoses seems to be an ever-expanding field. And I think he didn't get to see how that spread even into the realm of gender identity. So he was tracking the early developments. I think he would have been horrified to see how far it's gone. What he saw was the increasing medicalization of culture, and he did acknowledge, and he wrote very fluently about the political element. I think if he was alive today, he'd see it as the combination of politics and medicine has actually given over to mostly politics. So the medical profession now, arguably, their medical scientific knowledge has become even more subordinated to politics. So that with gender identity, for example, the political aspects of gender affirmation now override basic scientific biological interpretations of sexuality and gender. And that's something I don't think, got to see in his own lifetime. But it's ironic that because he's so very, not well known at all today, never has his work been more relevant. And I find that interesting. But I just thought to start off with, I found this vaguely amusing because, for those of you familiar with the channel, I have a very puerile sense of humour. But this is by Honoré Daumier, an illustrator and artist. And the idea is it's a prisoner being met by his lawyer, and the prison warden or guard is behind the lawyer. So they're having a chat, and this is the first line. The prisoner says, "What really bothers me is that I have been accused of 12 robberies." And the lawyer responds, "12 of them, so much the better. I will plead monomania." So I found this interesting because it's 1846, and obviously the humour behind the image is the idea that even that early, the legal defence of a mental illness or a mental condition is being parodied because it began to take off. This idea of you're responsible. So this guy's done 12 robberies. He's obviously had time to think about what he's doing. It wasn't a spontaneous theft, or it was spontaneous 12 times, which is a contradiction in terms. But the lawyer's immediate response is, "We'll plead monomania." And this goes to one aspect of Szasz's work. Was he was a very virulent critic of the idea of diminished responsibility in legal cases. So again, if I continue with a series on Szasz, I will look at specifically his work in the legal field. He was completely against the willingness and the haste with which a lot of psychiatrists will give evidence in trials. He sees it as basically fakery because they can't give objective opinions when they don't know the character. And to give you one very quick example, he makes the point whenever a psychiatrist gives evidence, they're giving evidence on what the person did, what their mental state was at the time of committing a crime. By the time it's got to trial, this may be 8 months, 9 months previously. And it's very unlikely the psychiatrist would have spoken to the person very close to the event that led to them being incarcerated. So Szasz's point was, on what basis are they making these judgments with such a time difference? How can they say with any certainty that their diagnosis is relevant? But anyway, so that's just one issue. And the significance of that, you might think, well, that's just about legal issues. But legal issues go directly to the, more so than any other aspect of our lives. If you're charged with a crime, it's about your personal responsibility for having done something wrong. And if our personal responsibility is chipped away at by legal excuses or the concept of diminished responsibility, for Szasz's, that had a direct effect on the whole notion of what he thought was personal responsibility and human freedom. And the ease with which we've accepted psychiatric diagnoses in the legal system, he argued, is a really bad thing. So these are just some of his books, and I've talked about the myth of mental illness in the previous video with the Macbeth thumbnail. I'll be quoting from the other two books a little bit today. And I just love the directness of the title. So ideology is a topic I'm talking about today, and insanity. Essays on the psychiatric dehumanization of man. So he doesn't hold back at all, and then even more directly, psychiatry, the science of lies. So he was quite in your face and combative, you might say, but given the context of the whole of the psychiatric profession was against him, they dug in, and basically he was a heretic of his time. And more of that later. The connotations of heretic with religion is interesting, but the idea that he had to stand up against, or he felt he had to stand up against a whole profession. And that might strike you, if you're going to be cynical, you could say, well, if he was standing on his own against this whole profession, isn't it much more likely that he's wrong and everybody else is right? Which leads on to the whole notion of what a heretic is today. And in a guise of tolerance, I repeat, we live in a society that's purportedly and superficially very, very tolerant, and tolerance is something that we value. Except there is an intolerance to anyone who speaks against the norm, what's deemed to be the common sense of the time. And I want to pursue that because I would argue Szasz and other people today, just because they're in a tiny minority, it really is interesting that if the truth has been suborned and submerged so much, anyone who does speak out automatically becomes this oddball, this weird heretic. But there are various ways in which you can prove that heretics of the past were actually right, and I'm going to give you examples shortly. But this is just a more humorous example, because Michael Fontaine, I think he's an academic in Cornell University, he does the classics, but I came across a couple of his essays in which he refers to Szasz and links it back to classical philosophy. And his argument is that what Szasz is doing can be seen, his rejection of therapeutic and psychological explanations for everything, Michael Fontaine argues, is in keeping with classical literature that didn't see everything in a psychological way. So in this particular essay, he describes, and it chimed with me because if any of you have ever been, and not necessarily an academic conference that he's about to talk about, but if you've been to any type of professional conference, that I just find them immensely depressing, going through the motion type events. So he describes what happened when he tried to give this paper on Thomas Szasz. So I presented the following comparison of the philosophic psychiatry of Thomas Szasz to the psychiatric philosophy of Epicurus in May 2014 at the 167th annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in New York City. Because Szasz had died late in 2012, I assumed it would be merely one of the several retrospectives of his thought and influence. In the event, mine was the only paper to mention him, and the circumstances afforded me for presenting it proved challenging. I was assigned to the last slot on the last day of the 5-day conference, that's happened to me before, to a session titled Topics of Interest, Rarely Presented. The first presentation discussed psychiatric patients' self-assessments of body weight, while the third dealt with psychiatric morbidity among Bangladeshi women in rural and slum populations. So I have quoted this. A, I think it's funny, so if you don't find it funny, tough luck. B, it's a very good indication of when he died, how low his status was. That a guy talking about his work was shunted off to one of, the least promoted panels in the whole conference. So this is what I want to explore today, the ideology and psychology of tolerance in a society that doesn't tolerate anyone. Our society is incredibly intolerant to anyone who's a heretic and goes against the prevailing ideology, goes against conformist thinking. Now, rather than just witter on in an airy-fairy way, I thought what would be quite interesting and unusual for me would be to actually quote from some overtly, absolutely, obviously scientific papers. So take theoretical, abstract, philosophical, or psychological learning out of all of this, or literary. My perspective tends to be quite literary or philosophical. But this is from a journal, Molecular Psychiatry. And I've chosen the date specifically because, as you can notice, this was from the year in which Szasz died. So I thought it was quite fitting. And then I'll give you a quote from a later paper from another, is it Frontiers Biology or something? I'll come up in a second. But I'm going to give you another quote from a different scientific journal to show you what the state of what they call biological psychiatry is. And what's interesting is Szasz spent his whole life saying that there are such things as physical illnesses. You can do laboratory tests for them. You can take x-rays. You can use various radiographic techniques. And the illnesses, the causality and etiology can be ascertained. It's verifiable. You can repeat the findings. There's very little subjective interpretation because it's medicine. It's about physical illness. He's always said you cannot do that with so-called mental illness because it's a false metaphor. Illness that is of a mental nature is not the same as physical illness. And by using the term mental illness, you smuggle in false equivalences. And he spent his whole life arguing for that. And the quote I'm going to give you now and in the next few slides from scientific papers is just backing up what he always said. That they've tried to find a biological basis for what are termed mental illnesses, and they've struggled to do it in any systematic way. Now, I've put there in the title the tolerance of no results. And what I find interesting about tolerance in the society we live in today, beyond moral issues, tolerance can also be understood in the sense of putting up with not moral questions, but putting up with, in a technocratic world that we live in, the constant failure of bureaucrats and managers to ever competently deliver the things they claim they build their so-called expertise upon. So I'm calling it the technocratic con. What really does bemuse me is why, especially in advanced Western societies, this myth that technocrats can do things that nobody else can do, when all the available evidence is they're no better than anyone else. But anyway, so this tolerance of no results. Biological psychiatry aims to understand mental disorders in terms of the biological function of the nervous system. By several measures, it has been a tremendous success. Thousands of scientific papers and hundreds of books devoted to this subject, legions of dedicated scientists and over 60 dedicated professional societies worldwide, and a profound impact on the public's perception of mental disorders. Despite these successes, it has not led to clinical tests that can be routinely used in the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. In the early 2000s, a series of white papers expressed hope that the advances in genetics, imaging, and new technologies might lead to a biologically supported psychiatric classification and diagnostic system. But a decade later, as we stand at the threshold of a new version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there are few biological clinical tests central to diagnosing psychiatric illnesses, other than those used to exclude physical illnesses. Now that's quite a mouthful, but what I've emboldened there, what I wanted to talk about in particular, were these phrases: by several measures, it has been a tremendous success. And this is Orwellian doublespeak, because the demonstration of the success is the activity, not successful outcomes. So his judgment, or the combined authors here, their judgment that there's been a tremendous success is based upon activity and just sheer output. Thousands of papers, hundreds of books, legions of dedicated scientists, and the success, insofar as there have been, they're claiming there has been a profound impact on the public's perception of mental disorders. That's true. But if you've got no evidence after all this effort, A, how do you call it a tremendous success? And B, you've contradicted yourself when you say, despite these successes, it has not led to clinical tests that can be routinely used. So they've snuck in there, despite these successes, after having claimed a tremendous success, while simultaneously admitting there hasn't been any positive outcome. And this is what technocrats do. They just play with the basic substance of language and represent shallowness as some type of profundity. And just to re-emphasize, this is in a paper that is in a journal that is sympathetic, that is premised upon recognizing the whole ethos of biological psychiatry. In other words, a medical approach to studying the mind. So it's not someone like Szasz sneering or sniping. This is from the home team admitting they haven't had actual clinical successes. So in a second, I'll show you a slightly later paper, because you could argue, well, this is 2012, maybe things change, but we'll see. So this is the conclusion, and I'm calling it the psychology of Mr. Micawber, because he was a character from Dickens' character from David Copperfield. And his tagline was "Something will turn up." He was the eternal optimist, like Professor Pangloss in Candide. So the conclusion to this paper, I think I just read you part of the introduction. So the conclusion is, biological psychiatry and the related neurosciences have changed mankind's view of itself and of mental illness, but have yet to provide biomedical tests for routine clinical practice. The delay is understandable given the later start than the rest of medicine, the complexity of the brain, and the nascence of neuroscientific techniques, and the evolving nature of psychiatric nosology. On the other hand, the opportunity afforded by the progress in genomics and imaging, combined with the computational abilities, is unprecedented and could deliver useful clinical tests. These tests will identify homogeneous populations for whom one could develop targeted new therapeutics, thus realizing a vision of a new stratified psychiatry that cuts across the traditional diagnostic boundaries while simultaneously transforming them. So basically, in any organization, this is the type of management gobbledygook that gets put, promulgated as if it means anything. So this is just wishful thinking. They're admitting they haven't had any real successes, but the future, something will turn up. The future is rosy. Just watch this space. So again, and genomics is relevant because I think in the next paper they refer to omics, which is just a punning shorthand for genomic techniques. So I'm suggesting in this other paper, so Garcia Gutierrez et al., in this paper, there's about 6 or 7 co-authors. I think that tends to happen in science papers. But biopsychiatry is eternal wait. So in 2020, nothing really had changed. We're all still waiting. But this tolerance of what science can't do, there seems to be a lot less tolerance for the fact that more philosophical or literary analyses can never, verifiably prove anything. It's obviously speculative and subjective, and that often gets denigrated and criticised. But I'm just pointing out, this completely backs up Szasz's point that there is physical medicine and there is so-called mental illness that is a completely different realm that can't and shouldn't be reduced or compared to physical illness. So this is from the paper Biomarkers in Psychiatry. As set out in this review, there are several proteins, metabolites and genes that have been linked with certain neuropsychiatric diseases, mainly due to the advance in omics technologies, genomic in other words. However, none of them have demonstrated to be a real and useful biomarker in clinical practice. So this repeats what was said in the introduction to the earlier paper 8 years before. It is expected that in the following years, considerable breakthroughs will occur in these regards. It's always tomorrow, isn't it? So, now I've had my little snippy snipes at molecular physics and chemistry and biological psychiatry. I'm deliberately punning here on the establishment of intolerance. So, how intolerance, often in the guise of tolerance today, how it's established, but also the role of the establishment, in other words, the dominant structures and institutions and powers within a society. So this is a painting by Cristiano Banti from 1857, and it's called Galileo Facing the Roman Inquisition. And from what I've read, the idea that Galileo was pursued by the Inquisition and life was made miserable, from what I've read, and I'm happy to be corrected, it's all a bit over egged, the pudding, and he wasn't given such a hard time at all. He wasn't really threatened. It was all a bit of a storm in a teacup. But he was told to recant this idea that the Earth rotated round the sun rather than the other way around, so the heliocentric theory of the universe. And he was alleged to have said, after he recanted, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. He was muttered under his breath, and yet it moves. So this is Galileo, in the scene being depicted, the paintings from 1857, the scene is from 1633. And Galileo, I mentioned earlier, just because you stand alone as a heretic, you can prove from events in history that the single heretic was afterwards proved demonstrably correct. So I find the marginalisation of Thomas Szasz no indicator that he was wrong at all. I actually think, we'll get into it more as we go along, that our society is in a weird, almost some type of mental contagion. And Thomas Szasz, A, was ahead of the game, partly because of the chronology of when he was working, but B, he just didn't subscribe to the establishment point of view when he knew the establishment was wrong. And I just find that quite inspiring, having worked in a university sector where the vast majority of academics know that the organisations are, the way they function is not the best way for students, and what goes on in various ways is ideologically biased. So just quickly, there aren't, for example, there isn't a genuine, how would you call it, ecology of different points of view. The vast majority of academics think politically and socially a certain way. And I would suggest that isn't really healthy for the way teaching then occurs, because students are getting a monoculture rather than being exposed to diverse points of view. That's just one example. But also from a financial point of view, universities in lots of ways became a Ponzi scheme, and huge numbers of administrators rather than actual academics work in universities now, and on and on and on. They've become businesses. So for lots of reasons. But it's interesting that academics who should be quite privileged in terms of having learnt to think critically, critical thinking as it's espoused by academics seems to be rarely applied to their own profession. And this goes on, many of you viewers will work in organisations where when there's a certain type of meeting, you'll know there'll be quite a few people in that meeting think a lot of what goes on, pardon my French, is just bullshit. But there's an asymmetry of causality whereby if you speak out against it, you can only do yourself harm professionally, and you won't do yourself any good. So people just keep their head down, don't say anything, and these pointless, stupid, vacuous meetings go on and on and on ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Anyway, I got that out of my system. Feel better. Another example of someone, the idea that the heretic's not always wrong. This Ignaz Semmelweis, I hope I've pronounced that vaguely correct, is was a Hungarian doctor, medical doctor. And before germ theory, before Louis Pasteur and others developed germ theory, he had this idea of cadaveric particles. So he couldn't prove it, but he worked on a maternity ward. And this was 1847 was the discovery, and physicians used to wash their hands with soap and water, and then examine pregnant women or women who've just not long delivered their child. And because they're only washing with soap and water, the babies and the mothers would become infected with diseases from the doctor's dirty hands. So it's quite gory, but they could do an autopsy and then go wash their hands in soap and water and then go and examine a baby and the mother. So when he thought that this wasn't the right way to do it, and he had this early theory of germ transmission called cadaveric particles, he introduced on his maternity ward a process whereby all doctors had to wash their hands in chlorine solution. And the mortality rate of mothers on his ward went down from the previous 18% to 1%. So without being able to provide the scientific causality, he was right, and later on he was proved right. But the establishment didn't like the inconvenience this would cause doctors, so they marginalised him. And it's very sad. He was eventually, through the pressure, was put in a mental asylum. He was beaten up by guards at one point for being unruly, and I think his hand got infected and he got gangrene, so he died as a result of a beating he got. And what this made me think of is the phrases up above. Ideology. Roland Barthes, the French thinker, used to define ideology as what goes without saying. I think this issue of heretics being right, but the establishment not allowing them, not tolerating them. So in this world of tolerance that we increasingly exist in, actually speaking against the conformist majority is not tolerated. There's an intolerance to that. That intolerance comes in the form of what can't be said, and I've added the rider, and not because it isn't true. So I'm interested in that aspect of intolerance, and I see it all around. You don't have to be, Sherlock Holmes to see how, for example, with the things like gender identity ideology, the assertion of what you want to be true now trumps actual scientific truth. And anyone who speaks against that, you basically, again, you've got this asymmetric in lots of organizations. Speaking out for the scientific truth does you no favors and can actually destroy your career. So that's the ideological form of intolerance, whilst purportedly and superficially the ideology of tolerance is to ensure that everyone's treated fairly and that we don't marginalize and victimize people, although people can lose their careers for speaking the truth. And on it goes. So this is from Szasz himself. He does this. It's a very interesting essay at the beginning of this book, Szasz Under Fire. I really enjoyed. It's a pile of essays. Some of them are broadly sympathetic and some of them are very critical of Szasz. So these people all submitted essays to this collected edition, and then Szasz replies to them. So he's obviously quite polite to the people who are quite nice to him, but to the people who don't like him, I just love the way he's just very direct and Eastern European. So it just appeals to my personality, I guess. But this idea of tolerance and its link, when there's an ideology of tolerance, ironically, majority falsehood becomes the truth. So I was deeply moved by the story of Semmelweis's tragic life. It taught me at an early age the lesson that it can be dangerous to be wrong, but to be right when society regards the majority's falsehood as truth could be fatal. This principle is especially true with respect to false truths that form an important part of an entire society's belief system. In the past, such basic false truths were religious in nature. In the modern world, they are political and medical in nature. So what I'd say here is, when society regards the majority's falsehood as truth, this is what I'd argue is happening all the time in modern society. Things that are demonstrably scientifically not true are now accepted for all intents and purposes as the truth against which no one's allowed to speak, unless you want to be doxed, trolled, whatever you want to call it. But this is interesting. In the past, such basic false truths were religious in nature. So the Inquisition was religious, obviously, theologically informed. In the modern world, most of Szasz's work is about medical, how ethics and morality has been medicalized by psychiatric developments and the spread of therapeutic culture. He does talk about the political aspects of that. So he basically says Freud and people after Freud were pretending to be medical but were actually being political. But to repeat what I said earlier, I think what's actually interesting now is we've moved on a pace, and what used to be the medical establishment has now become subordinated to the ideology of tolerance, inverted commas, which is a political activist movement. And to give you a very specific example, as in the UK, the Supreme Court, not that long ago, made a judgment about the extent to which public spaces there are women-only spaces, and in order to ascertain how to protect women-only spaces, you have to first of all say what a woman is. So, in the light of gender identity politics, the Supreme Court made what was thought to be at the time a definitive judgment about what a woman was, which I thought was brilliant because for thousands of years, we haven't been quite sure what a woman is. So you need a legal establishment to tell people that. And that is an indication of the idea that truth in a modern context is so up for grabs that what's been known for thousands of years can be, you need to wait. The British government at the time said we need to wait for the legal judgment. And this is how the idea that what was medical in nature has become political. It's a pretty good example. So this again is Szasz being quite direct. Diseases of the body have causes, such as infectious agents or nutritional deficiencies. Often they can be prevented and cured by dealing with those causes. Persons said to have mental diseases, on the other hand, have reasons for their actions. Reasons for such actions must be understood and represented the same way that novelists and playwrights understand and depict the motivations of fictional characters and their behaviours. So in that emboldened phrase, I think you'll see why I like Szasz and why he fits with this channel's ethos. He basically says, as far as so-called mental illnesses go, the real people you should listen to or read are novelists and playwrights, not people claiming to have medical expertise. A deep sense of the invincible social power of false truths enabled me to conceal my ideas from representatives of received psychiatric wisdom until such time that I was no longer under their educational or economic control, and to conduct myself in such a way that would minimise the chances of being cast in the role of enemy of the people. So Ibsen wrote about this, the way in which people are marginalised and turned into heretics, enemy of the people. But I like that phrase, a deep sense of the invincible social power of false truths. This is what we're living through today, I'd argue. It's so psychologically, I'd argue it is very unhealthy to live in a society where what was true yesterday has suddenly become false. It's an obvious observation to make, but it is Orwellian. The idea that what you know to be true can just be falsified by either government or social diktat. So this deep sense of the invincible social power of false truths is a great way to describe it. And this is, sorry, if you'll forgive me, this is a little aside. I hope to deal with this at some point in the future. I think he's Belgian, the author Matthias Desmet. But this psychology of totalitarianism, I think from memory he was inspired by lockdown and the way in which populations bovinely or ovinely, given that the thumbnail is of a sheep, ovinely went along with what they were told. And it's in addition to, I gave in a previous video, I think I showed you the image of Jay Lifton, the thought reform. his book about pre-Maoist, Maoist China, just before the Cultural Revolution, the way people were brainwashed, and it was called thought reform. So these are the type of books that I am fascinated by, the psychology of how, in the guise of being tolerant, this whole issue about the truth is turned upside down, and anyone who objects to the truth being turned upside down is deemed intolerant. And this goes back to the early epigraph from Albert Camus. You're actually innocent because you believe in the truth, and yet you have to justify your belief in the truth, while the people peddling falsehoods are the dominant majority. So this is the upside down world we live in. And just as one little aside, regarding this book, it made me think of the emotional investment during lockdown people had in face masks. That, again, I think you can biologically prove now, played very little role in stopping the spread of the virus. But apart from that, we had in Wales, it was, if we're going to talk about technocracy, there was a Welsh leader of Labour called Mark Drakeford, who was the embodiment of the person, the technocrat who's had a charismarectomy, quite a severe charismarectomy. He made Keir Starmer look like Peter Ustinov. He made Keir Starmer look like the life and soul of the party. Mark Drakeford, in case you're not getting my argument, was a dull man. But he instituted, as the first minister of Wales, this devolved government in the UK. He had, I think part of it was to distinguish, it happened in Scotland as well, to show that you're not part of England. They conducted lockdown in different ways. So Drakeford decided that you could go to the supermarket, but only for essential products. And he decided, in all his wisdom, that female sanitary products weren't essential. So there were, I remember vividly, in the supermarket, the area where you'd go and buy female sanitary products was roped off. And I think anyone who's vaguely reasonable would say this was just technocratic, bureaucratic, dullard overreach of pathological proportions. And yet people went along with it. So I just think this book is a very interesting insight into how we let ourselves be led. And in a sense, it's because in the promotion of tolerance, it's become almost a religious. And Szasz was an atheist. He didn't have much time for religion at all because he saw it as undermining human independence and personal responsibility. What I'd say, though, is that for all the faults you can critique traditional religions of various forms for, at least they're theologically complex. So I could spend, 100 videos exploring the book of Job, which questions the justice of God. And it's incredibly sophisticated. Whereas the way religion manifests itself today is in a secular religion that promotes tolerance in a profoundly ideological, non-subtle, non-nuanced way. So that's the only little rider I'd add to that. Only as an adult did I begin to understand religions as important cultural symbolic manifestations of human nature and appreciate that most people value dependence on authority and the illusory security it provides more highly than they value independence and having the courage to face the uncertainties of the human condition, unaided by gods and their deputies. And again, to re-emphasize, I think this is why Szasz never became, or hasn't sustained, the popularity he once might have had, because he doesn't offer easy answers. He's telling you life is tough. I think Jay, Incontinent Jay from Texas, in the comments pointed out in a different discussion about Szasz that it's relevant if you've ever seen The Sopranos. Irina, I think she's called, the Eastern European woman that Tony Soprano inevitably has to have a short affair with. And she's only got one leg, and she's had a terrible life in Eastern Europe. And she's an amazing foil for all the spoiled, affluenza-ridden Americans in the program. So she's absolutely had a terrible life, but she's completely self-dependent. She hardly ever complains, and she gets on with life. And that seems to me the social, cultural context SARS came from. And with respect to North Americans, because I don't think Britain's any better, we're just the 51st state to some extent. That notion of being responsible for your own actions, showing dependency, not relying on authorities to do everything for you, those days seem to have gone, and that's why he's not offering anything easy. Why would you subscribe to SARS's point of view if it's difficult? It's, for example, why I never go to the gym. So, another reason I like SARS is he doesn't like Rousseau. And again, I always promise future videos. I know it's like a tick, but I will do something in future on Rousseau. I honestly think Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of the most underestimated causes of human misery in history. I think his daft ideas, his ridiculous misrepresentation of human psychology, and his utopian notions of social change did more harm than possibly even Marx. I think he set the ball rolling, Rousseau. But anyway, I'm going to go off on one. This is SARS speaking. Among the many foolish things Rousseau said, one of the most foolish and the most famous is, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he's in chains." This high-flown phrase obscures the nature of freedom. For if freedom is the ability to make uncoerced choices, then man is born in chains, and the challenge of life is liberation. So again, it's the opposite of what people want to hear. So the heading there, the ideology and tolerance of dependency. We live in a society in which the dominant ideology is one which tolerates and promotes the idea that we are dependent beings. So Rousseau's idea that we have this birthright of freedom, yet everywhere we're oppressed. Again, you'd have to be Sherlock Holmes to see how that's influenced this constant ideology of people are oppressed, and that's what's stopping them achieving whatever they want to in life, not because of it's anything to do with their own fault or lack of self-discipline. So man is born in chains. The innocent and helpless victim. He's being sarcastic here, SARS. He's re-representing Rousseau's point of view. Man is born in chains, the innocent and helpless victim of internal passions and external controls that shape and possess him. Personal development, then, is a process of individual liberation in which control and self-direction supplant internal anarchy and external constraint. Hence, the prerequisites of individual liberty are not only freedom from arbitrary political and interpersonal control, mastery of the technical complexities of sophisticated artifacts, and self-assertion and self-confidence sufficient for the development and displays of one's creative potentialities, but also, and more important still, self-discipline. See how old school he was. This isn't going to go down well today. So I'm expanding this idea of ideology of tolerance to this notion of, and the notion of dependency that's just been outlined, to my bugbear, technocracy. So I'm talking about the ideology and tolerance of technocratic dependency. We put up with these people who present themselves as having expertise when in fact they don't. So by seeking relief from the burden of his moral responsibilities, man mystifies and technicizes his problems in living. And that, on the other hand, the demand for help thus generated is now met by a behavioural technology ready and willing to free man of his moral burdens by treating him as a sick patient. This human need and the professional technical response to it form a self-sustaining cycle, resembling what the nuclear physicist calls a breeder reaction. Once initiated, and having reached a critical stage, the process feeds on itself, transforming more and more human problems and situations into specialised technical problems to be solved by so-called mental health professionals. I've had £1 for every interview that Szasz did that I've watched, where he said, when he's questioned by a very bemused and puzzled interviewer who's not used to this direct critique of the modern sensibility, he just says, in this thick European accent, life is no picnic, which is, I just find that hilarious. And true. Life is tough. Life is hard. Yes, go and get your pills off the doctor, but the same problems are going to be waiting when the drugs wear off. And again, that's not a message the contemporary society wants to hear. And another reason why Szasz hasn't become very well known. So I'm suggesting that what Szasz did write about was the way in which theology got replaced by scientific ideology. So the Inquisition, he did a book called The Manufacture of Madness, which I'll hopefully look at in future. And in that, he specifically compares the mental health industry to the Spanish Inquisition. And as Monty Python said, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. But it's very entertaining, as you'd expect from Szasz. But we seem to have moved on. So when Szasz was mostly writing in the 70s, 80s and onwards, it was still the fact that medicalisation of society, the medical aspect was still dominant. But as I mentioned earlier, when medicine has now become subordinated to politics, we've gone from at least, even if you could argue medicalisation of so-called mental illness is a wrong step, at least you can try and have a rational discussion with doctors claiming scientific status. So you could argue with the doctors, for example, you're claiming scientific status when you treat psychiatric patients, but if you look at the evidence, you're not doing very well, are you? And they will have a load of replies and responses, fair enough. But you're having a rational discussion. When everything turns into pure ideology, school children in the UK have self-identified as hedgehogs, and the teachers haven't intervened and said, stop being so bloody stupid, Johnny. They've indulged them. That's an indication of pure ideology has taken over. And in the subtitle, their essays on the psychiatric dehumanisation of man, only in the current climate in the UK could a child seeing themselves as a hedgehog talk about literal dehumanisation, and that's not seen as a cause for concern. A very prickly issue. Modern psychiatric ideology is an adaptation to a scientific age of the traditional ideology of Christian theology. Instead of being born into sin, man is born into sickness. Instead of a life being a veil of tears, it's a veil of diseases. And, as in his journey from the cradle to the grave, man was formerly guided by the priest, so now he is guided by the physician. In short, whereas in the age of faith the ideology was Christian, the technology clerical, and the expert priestly, in the age of madness the ideology is medical, the technology clinical, and the expert psychiatric. And my argument is you could change that now. In the age of mad ideology, the ideology is political, the technology is ideological, and the expert ideological. Everything's just pure ideology now. It doesn't seem to need to be based in any form of reality. So the language of intolerance, language is a theme I want to return to with Szasz because I think it's absolutely crucial. Rulers have always conspired against their subjects and sought to keep them in bondage, and to achieve their aims, they have always relied on force and fraud. Indeed, when the justificatory rhetoric with which the oppressor conceals and misrepresents his true aims and methods is most effective, as had been the case formerly with tyranny, justified by theology, and is the case now with tyranny justified by therapy. The oppressor succeeds not only in subduing his victim, but also in robbing him of a vocabulary for articulating his victimization, thus making him a captive deprived of all means of escape. So I think this is a crucial element of the whole tolerance, intolerance ideology. If you can capture language, then how do you voice your opposition? So I think this goes to the fact that you could refer to certain groups in society as the alphabet people, the never-ending expansion of the self-ascribed designation of what they are through these acronyms, these alphabetic, talk about a breeder reaction, a nuclear breeder reaction. The letters just keep getting added and added to these acronyms. And the way in which words, like I say, that have for thousands of years everyone's known what they've meant, suddenly get co-opted by an ideological movement that demands that their definition is the only true definition. This is why language matters, because how do you voice your opposition when the very terms of your opposition are ruled as inadmissible? So how the ideology and the way it works against genuine tolerance, so the ideology and intolerance, and how all this relates to the concept of responsibility. The mandate of the contemporary psychiatrist, that is, of the professionally loyal, dynamic or progressive psychiatrist, is precisely to obscure and indeed to deny the ethical dilemmas of life and to transform these into medicalized and technolized problems susceptible to professional solutions. In short, I shall try to show that the claims and practices of modern psychiatry dehumanize man by denying, on the basis of spurious scientific reasoning, the existence or even the possibility of personal responsibility. But the concept of personal responsibility is central to the concept of man as moral agent. Without it, individual freedom, Western man's most cherished value, becomes a denial of reality, a veritable psychotic delusion to endow man with a grandeur he does not in fact possess. Again, I refer you back to the epigraph from Camus, this idea that the innocent start to have to defend themselves. In the current ideological climate that claims to be tolerant, you actually have to make an active argument to defend the basic principle of individual freedom from this constant intrusion of these weirdly ideological norms that have been introduced that are incredibly abnormal but appear under the guise of being the accepted reality that goes against every reality we've ever been familiar with until now. And again, just a little aside, all of this you could also, it was interesting that Thomas Szasz, one of the elements he wrote about, because he was writing about psychiatry and how he saw it as being misapplied in American society, he often, well, not often, but he gave evidence in cases. It was quite funny. Typically in a legal case, a psychiatrist would give evidence for the defense or the prosecution, and they would meet with the person they're assessing and give their clinical judgment. What really annoyed, he was accused of bringing his profession into disrepute because he'd give a clinical judgment, but he would absolutely refuse to meet the defendant. And he did this repeatedly because he said, it was my point earlier about, if he met the person, he wouldn't be meeting the person at the time they committed the offence anyway. So why does he need to meet them? He could review the evidence and give an opinion, which was almost invariably, yeah, he's an evil man. I'm not going to make a psychological excuse for him. But there is, I keep mentioning The Firing Line, the TV series in America. But if you go on, I've included it in the description box, there was this case. This is a non-fiction account of a terrible murder that happened in 1970 in the States. So the guy here that's being depicted was Jeffrey MacDonald, and he was an army medic. And it's a very complicated story. I can't do it full justice, but basically, he was found guilty eventually after a number of trials of killing his pregnant wife and killing his own two children, two daughters. One was 5 and one was 2. It was absolutely horrendous if you read all the trial transcripts. And what was interesting in this particular case, the judge excluded psychiatric expert opinion because both the prosecution and defense got experts, and those psychiatric experts completely disagreed with each other 180 degrees. So the judge quite reasonably said, I won't let the evidence be admitted because it'll just confuse the jury. Who do they believe? And it undermined, in the firing line edition I've put in the description box, the author Joe McGinnis, the journalist, befriended Jeffrey MacDonald and then wrote an incredibly negative. He went in with open, neutral basically, and I think he thought initially Jeffrey MacDonald was innocent. He befriends him, he writes this book with initially Jeffrey MacDonald's permission, and comes to the realization he thinks MacDonald is guilty. And then there was a whole court case based on that because McGuinness was accused of betraying journalistic ethics. And anyway, it gets very complicated. But in the firing line video, the author of the book about the case debates with 2 psychiatrists the legitimacy of so-called expert psychiatric opinion in a case like this, and how this relates to all the other previous slides about personal responsibility. Psychiatrists inevitably try and claim diminished responsibility, and they take out of the hands of a jury the ability to say, no, this person is just plain evil. So I would advise, if you're interested in true crime and you're not familiar with, I think it's a very famous case in America, but this book is a very good one, and you could spend years following the amount that was written about this case and how long, and I think he's still alive in prison after all these years. Apologies if I've got that wrong. So beginning to sum up, compelled language. So you're compelled, you're voicing the ideology of tolerance. Everything I'd learned and thought about mental illness, psychiatry and psychoanalysis from my teenage years through medical school and my psychiatric and psychoanalytical training confirmed my view that mental illness is a fiction, that psychiatry resting on force and fraud is social control, and that psychoanalysis properly... God, put my lips back on. Teach me for too much Botox. And that psychoanalysis, properly conceived, has nothing to do with illness or medicine or treatment, but is a special kind of confidential dialogue that often helps people resolve some of their personal problems and may help them improve their ability to cope with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So the Shakespearean Hamlet reference there. But again, this is what Szasz isn't saying. When he says mental illness is a fiction, he then goes on to give a fictional reference to Hamlet. He's not saying what's called mental illness isn't something that involves suffering and doesn't need dealing with. He's just saying that the psychiatric profession rests on force and fraud. They can imprison someone they deem to be insane, and that person loses all their constitutional rights. And this notion of social control. So even when you're not talking about excessive psychiatric involvement and coercion and intrusion, the social control element is alive and well today in the medicalized therapeutic language that controls us all. The absurdity of medicalizing psychoanalysis was nicely captured in an old spoof about psychoanalytical diagnoses and derivatively psychiatric diagnoses as well. If the patient is early for his appointment, he's anxious. If he's on time, he's compulsive. If he's late, he's hostile. So that goes back to the Dormier picture I showed you earlier on, the illustration. A psychiatrist can find a diagnostic reason for absolutely anything. Except for a few objectively identifiable brain diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, there are neither biological or chemical tests nor biopsy or necropsy findings for verifying or falsifying diagnostic and statistical manual diagnoses. It's noteworthy that in 1952, when the American Psychiatric Association published the first edition of its diagnostic and statistical manual, it did not include hysteria in its roster of mental diseases, even though it was the most common psychiatric diagnosis disease until that time. The terms historical and semantic allusions to women and uteruses were too embarrassing, so hysteria thinks from the Greek word for uterus, and when Freud was doing his initial work, there was this Victorian hysterical woman trope that he built a lot of his early work on. And what Szasz is pointing out is the very founding disease of what enabled psychoanalysis to become mainstream was this hysteria that we're now almost too embarrassed to recognize. And this goes to the evolving nature of so-called mental illnesses. However, the American Psychiatric Association did not declare hysteria to be a non-disease. Instead, it renamed it conversion reaction and somatization disorder. Similarly, in 1973, when the APA removed homosexuality from its roster of mental illnesses, just think about that. It wasn't until 1973 that homosexuality wasn't deemed to be a mental illness. It first replaced it with ego-dystonic homosexuality. When that term too became an embarrassment, it too was abolished. However, psychiatric researchers lost no time discovering a host of new mental maladies, ranging from attention deficient. I need to get my lips taken for a servicing. That sounds worse than it was meant. Anyway, quickly moving on. Ranging from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder to caffeineism and pathological gambling. And this would be one of my beefs, the idea that everything just suddenly becomes a potential disease. So if you've got a weakness for gambling, I'm sure it can ruin your life. But the idea that it's a disease, Szasz is just incredibly cynical about. Or the fact that young kids might find it difficult to sit down and concentrate in incredibly dull classes. So let's give it the name of a disease. So that we're back to Michael Scott Fontaine. And I like this almost, what would you call it? A soliloquy for an elegy for Szasz. Someday Szasz will be hailed as a pillar of Western civilization, but that day is still far off. The problem with a mass delusion is that by definition, only the heretics know when we are living through one. The rest of us can't tell. In 17th century Europe, everyone knew that they had an immortal soul and that witches could harm it. Today, it seems, everyone knows that the soul is just the brain and that medical doctors can heal it. Szasz realised that assumption was false and devoted his life to saying so. The great but simple truth that he derived from it, and from which all his subsequent ideas flow, is that faith in medicine is still faith, not medicine. So I think that's a really nice summary of the unloved role of the heretic and how they stand alone against what changes over time. The labels change. So you had the Spanish Inquisition, then you had the psychiatric institutions and the psychiatric profession, and now you've got the ideology police. But ultimately, all of these movements are new forms of faith. They're not science, they're not medicine, They're not genuine understanding of the human condition. They're just ideologically driven. So this is Szasz summing up at the end of the introduction to the Psychiatry, the Science of Lies. I choose the term polemics deliberately because psychiatrists and others now often use this word pejoratively and dismissively, as if the arguments of a polemical piece, like those of a schizophrenic person, were, ipso facto, by virtue of the defining adjective, irrational, irrelevant to the issues addressed, and hence meriting dismissal rather than dialogue. We must keep in mind, however, that the English word polemic comes from the Greek polemos, meaning war, or as in polemikos, meaning warlike, and that Webster's defines the adjectives polemic and polemical as of the nature of, pertaining to, or involving controversy. The term controversy implies argument and disputation between persons holding different opinions, each to be evaluated on its merits. This is anathema to psychiatry, just as it is anathema to religion. You can argue with people who hold opinions, but not with people who pronounce truths. And this is especially, so when he says this is an anathema to psychiatry, just as it is an anathema to religion, just as it is anathema to the gender politics identity police. And just one thing, it is ironic, I think Szasz learnt English. He didn't come to America till he was 18, and he had no English when he arrived. I think I'm trying to remember, he obviously spoke fluent Hungarian. He also was fluent in German and French, I think. So English was his fourth language. But ironically, because of that, I think he pays very close attention to the use of language. And maybe nowadays we need that more than ever. So I'll just finish with this to tie in with the thumbnail. Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. That's the Gospel of St. Matthew, which I think pretty much sums up the tenor of today. So, I hope you enjoyed that. I won't use the word fixated, but I really do like the work of Thomas Szasz because I see it tying into, I just finished there with the notion of language and how he saw it as crucially important, and it should be obvious that's one of the major elements of this whole channel, and the way in which Szasz refers repeatedly to literary works, which he sees as a better resource for understanding the human mind than any pseudo-medical psychiatric movement. So I'll always be sympathetic to him, if only for that. So I hope you enjoyed that. Till the next time, all the very best. Take care.